The morning James Whitfield told me his son would never walk, he said it the way men like him say most things, not cruelly, not kindly, just factually. The way you state a number on a spreadsheet that has already been verified by 3 different people and is no longer open for discussion. His son Caleb was 4 years old. He had been 4 years old for 11 days. He had spina bifida, a condition that had been diagnosed before he was born, that had required 2 surgeries in his first year of life, and that his team of specialists at Yale New Haven Hospital had assessed, carefully and thoroughly, as leaving him with permanent paralysis below the waist. The specialists were not wrong. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because this is not a story about medicine being wrong or miracles happening or a child defying the laws of what the human body can do. The specialists were right about what the condition was and right about what it meant and right that Caleb would spend his life in a wheelchair. What they could not tell James Whitfield, and what James Whitfield could not have known when he told me his son would never walk, was that a boy in a wheelchair can still take a step, not a medical step, not a rehabilitative step. The kind of step a 4-year-old takes when something across the room is more interesting than the fact that his legs don't work the way other legs work. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Warren Cole. I am 52 years old. I have done building maintenance and janitorial work for 24 years, the last 11 of them at the Whitfield Institute for Pediatric Research in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a private research facility funded primarily by James Whitfield's Family Foundation and dedicated to treatments for pediatric neurological conditions. It is, in other words, a building full of some of the most brilliant people in the world working on some of the hardest problems in medicine. And I am the man who keeps their floors clean and their toilets working and their HVAC filters changed on schedule, so that they can do that work without thinking about any of those things. I have a son named Marcus. He is 23 years old, works as an electrician in Bridgeport, and is the best person I know after his mother, who passed away from ovarian cancer when Marcus was 16, and who I have missed every day since, in the specific way you miss the person who was the center of the life you built together. Marcus and I did not have an easy few years after his mother died. I will not dress that up. We had the years we had, which were hard and honest, and occasionally terrible, and produced, eventually, a young man who knows how to work and how to be present for the people who need him, which is everything his mother would have wanted and everything I tried my imperfect best to give him. I am telling you about Marcus, because what I know about raising a child through difficulty is the thing that made me do what I did for Caleb. And I want you to understand where it came from before I tell you what it was. The Whitfield Institute occupied 3 floors of a converted building on Whalley Avenue in New Haven. James Whitfield had his administrative offices on the 3rd floor. The research labs were on the 2nd. The 1st floor had meeting rooms and a small clinical observation suite where patient consultations sometimes took place. I worked all 3 floors. My shift started at 5:30 in the morning and ended at 2 in the afternoon, which meant I was usually finishing the 3rd floor around the time the researchers were arriving for their day, which meant I had spent 11 years being invisible in rooms where very important conversations happened. James Whitfield was 49 years old, lean, silver at the temples, with the particular manner of a man who had inherited significant wealth and had then spent 30 years proving he deserved it by building something meaningful with it. He was not a warm man, but he was a serious one, and in my experience, serious is more useful than warm in the long run. He had co-founded the institute with his wife Catherine 12 years earlier, after their first child, a daughter named Ellie, had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition at age 2 and had died at age 5. The institute was built from that grief. It was, I always thought, one of the more honest things a person could do with money and loss. Caleb was his 2nd child. His wife Catherine had died in childbirth, which is a sentence I have always found almost impossible to hold in my mind because of the specific weight of it, the boy arriving and the mother leaving in the same moment. which is a thing that should not happen and does happen, and leaves a particular shape of absence in a family that nothing fills. James Whitfield had raised Caleb alone from birth, which means he had raised a child with significant medical needs alone, which means he had become, in the years I watched him from the periphery of his building, the specific kind of man that is produced by that specific kind of requirement, exhausted, precise, deeply loving in a way he did not know how to express, and absolutely certain that certainty was the only protection he had left against a world that had already taken too much from him. He told me about the prognosis on a Tuesday morning in March. I was mopping the third-floor corridor outside his office. He came out of his door speaking on the phone about something unrelated, saw me, paused his call, and for reasons I have never fully understood told me what the Yale team had concluded about Caleb's prospects for mobility. He said, "They're telling me he won't walk." "Never." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." He said, "It's a fact, not a tragedy. Facts can be planned around." And then he went back into his office and continued his call, and I went back to mopping. I thought about what he had said for the rest of my shift, not about the medical facts of it, which were beyond my knowledge. About the word fact. About the way a man who has already lost a child and a wife has to turn the hardest things into facts, because facts can be planned around and grief cannot, and planning is the only tool he has left. I have been in buildings for 24 years. Buildings are full of people turning the hardest things into facts, because facts can be managed and the other things cannot. I understand it. I have done it myself. But I have also learned, across 24 years and one lost wife and one son who needed me to be more than a manager of facts, that the facts about what a person cannot do are almost never the complete truth about what a person might do anyway. Caleb came to the Institute occasionally, not often. James Whitfield kept his work life and his personal life as separate as a man in his position can keep them, which is to say not very separate at all, but with a clear attempt being made. When Caleb came, he was usually with his full-time caregiver, a woman named Patricia, who had been with the family since Caleb was 3 months old and who managed him with the particular combination of efficiency and warmth that is the specific gift of people who are very good at caring for children. Caleb was in a wheelchair. It was a good wheelchair, well-fitted, clearly expensive, with the modifications that made it work for a 4-year-old's size and weight. He navigated it with his arms, with the ease of a child who has never known anything different, which is to say completely, without self-consciousness, with the particular confidence of someone for whom this is simply how the world is traversed. I noticed Caleb the way I notice most things in buildings, gradually, through accumulation. The specific sound of his wheelchair on the first-floor tile. The way Patricia always positioned him near the window in the small waiting area off the main entrance when they came, because the window faced a courtyard where there were birds. The fact that he watched the birds with a focused attention that I recognized, because Marcus had watched things the same way at that age, not casually, but with the full investment of a child, for whom the world is still something to be taken seriously. I had not spoken to Caleb directly. My work and his presence in the building did not overlap in ways that required it. I had smiled at him twice, and he had looked at me with the assessing expression of a 4-year-old deciding whether a new person was worth categorizing. I apparently had not passed the assessment, because he had not smiled back either time. This changed on a Wednesday afternoon in April, 6 weeks after James Whitfield told me about the prognosis. I was cleaning the first-floor corridor outside the waiting area, later than usual, because a pipe fitting on the second floor had required my attention that morning and pushed my schedule back by 2 hours. Patricia was in the waiting area with Caleb, who was positioned near the window watching the courtyard birds. Patricia was on her phone, not negligently, just the normal way a caregiver takes a few minutes, when the child is settled and content. I was mopping the corridor and, because I am a person who talks while I work the same way Gus Reyes narrates his cooking, I was talking to the mop. Not loudly. Just the low continuous murmur of a man who has spent 24 years alone in buildings and has made his peace with it by treating the work as a conversation. I was saying something about the wax buildup in the corner near the baseboard that I had been meaning to address for 2 weeks and kept not addressing because there was always something more urgent. And the corner was sitting there waiting patiently the way corners do. Caleb said, "Why are you talking to it?" I stopped. I looked up. He was turned in his wheelchair, looking at me through the open doorway of the waiting area. His expression was the 4-year-old assessment expression, but this time with something else in it, the particular interest of a child who has just heard a person do something unexpected and wants to understand it. I said, "Because if I don't tell it what I'm going to do, it gets surprised." He looked at the corner I had been addressing. He said, "Does it understand?" I said, "Probably not, but it makes me feel better." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I talk to my wheels sometimes." I said, "What do you tell them?" He said, "Where we're going." I said, "Does that help?" He said, "Yes, because then they know." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "That makes a lot of sense to me." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the window and the birds. I went back to the corner. That was our first conversation. It lasted about 90 seconds and covered the topics of talking to inanimate objects and the importance of informing them of your intentions. I have had more consequential conversations in my life, but not many that felt more like the beginning of something real. I want to tell you what happened over the next 7 months, because it did not happen quickly and it did not happen dramatically, and both of those things are important. Over the next 7 months, Caleb came to the Institute approximately once every 2 weeks, sometimes more. The schedule was not fixed. When he came, I was usually somewhere on the first floor at the point in my schedule where his arrival overlapped with my work. Sometimes I was in the corridor, sometimes in the supply room near the entrance, occasionally in the small maintenance closet near the waiting area that I used as a staging area for equipment. Each time, if our paths crossed, we talked, always briefly, always about whatever Caleb wanted to talk about, which was usually one of 3 things: birds, which he knew a significant amount about for a 4-year-old, the mechanisms of things, specifically how things moved and what made them move, and occasionally, and always without preamble, a specific thing he had been thinking about that he wanted to say out loud to someone who would hear it without making it into something. I became, over those 7 months, that person for Caleb. Not because I did anything special, not because I had training or a strategy or a plan, because I was in the building and I was working, and when he talked I listened, and I answered without making a project of him. The same thing I had tried to do for Marcus after his mother died. Put yourself in the same place at the same time. Do your work. Do not require anything. Let them come to you when they're ready and go when they need to go. It is not a complicated approach. It is the only approach I know that works with people who are carrying something heavy and have not yet decided whether to put it down. In month 3, Caleb started watching me work. Not just talking, watching. He would position his wheelchair at the edge of whatever room I was in and observe the work with the same focused attention he gave the birds in the courtyard. He asked questions about the equipment. Why that mop and not a different one? What the difference was between the 2 cleaning solutions in my cart. Why I went left to right instead of right to left in certain rooms. I answered all of it. Not because I thought it was therapeutic or developmental or useful for him in any measurable way. Because they were good questions, and they deserved answers. And because a child who asks good questions is a child whose mind is working exactly the way a mind is supposed to work, and that deserves to be taken seriously. In month 5, he asked if he could try. I said, "Try what?" He said, "The mop." I looked at him. He was in his wheelchair. The mop handle was taller than his head. I said, "It's a bit tall for you." He said, "I know. Can I try anyway?" I said. I shortened the mop handle as far as it would go, which was still too tall for him to use from a seated position in the way mopping is normally done. He looked at it. He thought about it. Then he said, "If I lean forward, can I reach?" I said, "Lean forward and we'll see." He leaned forward from the wheelchair. He could reach the handle. He could not generate the right angle or the right pressure to actually mop effectively, but he could hold the handle and make the motion, which was what he wanted to do. And so I held the bucket and he made the motion, and we went slowly down about 4 feet of corridor together. When he stopped, he said, "It's harder than it looks." I said, "Most things are." He nodded. He handed me the handle. He sat back in his chair. He said, "I'll get better at it." I said, "Probably." He came back 2 weeks later, and we did it again, and again 2 weeks after that. Each time he could reach a little further, manage a little more pressure, cover a little more corridor before his arms told him he was done. I tracked none of this. I kept no notebook. This was not research. This was a child who wanted to do a thing and an adult who said yes and moved the bucket. That is the complete description of what I did. In month 7, on a Wednesday afternoon in November, Caleb arrived at the institute with Patricia and positioned himself near the window in the waiting area in the usual way. I was in the maintenance closet across the corridor, approximately 12 feet from where he sat. The closet door was open. I was reorganizing the supply shelves, which I had been meaning to do for a month. I had my mop bucket with me because I had been using it earlier and had not yet returned it to its storage position. I was narrating, the way I always narrate, talking to the shelves about where things were going to go and why. I heard the wheelchair move. Not far, just the small sound of it shifting. I did not look up. I kept working. I heard it again. Closer. I heard something else. A sound I had not heard before in 11 years of working in that building. The specific sound of effort, not distress, not pain, but the particular physical effort sound of someone doing something their body finds very difficult and is doing anyway. I looked up from the shelf I was organizing. Caleb was at the door of the maintenance closet. He was not in the wheelchair. He was standing at the door of the maintenance closet, one hand gripping the door frame, both legs under him, shaking slightly with the effort of holding himself up. He was 4 years old and he was standing. He looked at me. His expression was the most concentrated expression I have ever seen on a child's face. Not triumph, not pain, pure effort held very still. He said, without letting the effort out of his voice, I told my legs where we were going. He took one step. His legs did not cooperate the way legs are supposed to cooperate, but they moved. He moved. He covered the 12 inches between the door frame and the mop bucket in approximately 45 seconds, which is a very long time for 12 inches, and which I am not sure I breathed through. He reached the bucket. He put both hands on the handle. He looked up at me. He said, "Told you." I said, "And I want to be honest with you." I said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing in my throat that was usable yet. Then I said, "Yeah, you did." He stood there, hands on the mop handle, for another moment. Then he said, "My arms are tired." I said, "You can sit down." He lowered himself carefully to the floor. He sat on the floor of the maintenance closet with both hands on the mop handle and looked at the 12 inches he had just covered. I sat down on the floor beside him. We sat there for a while without talking. Patricia appeared in the doorway. She looked at Caleb on the floor, then at me on the floor, then at Caleb again. Her hand went to her mouth. "He's okay," she said, very quietly. "I know." James Whitfield found out 2 days later. I do not know exactly how Patricia described it to him. I know that he came to the first floor on a Friday morning, which was unusual, and that he stood in the door of the maintenance closet for a long time looking at the distance between the door frame and the mop bucket. I was not there when he first came. I came around the corner with my cart, and he was standing in the doorway, looking at 12 inches of corridor floor. He heard me coming and turned around. His face was doing something I had not seen it do in 11 years, not crying. Men like James Whitfield do not cry in corridors. Something adjacent to it. Something that happens in the face when a wall that was built to keep certain things out has just developed a crack, and the light is coming through, whether the wall wants it to or not. He said, 12 inches. I said, yes. He said, the doctors told me. I said, I know what they told you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How? I said, he told his legs where they were going. He looked at me. I said, that's what he said. He told his legs where they were going. Whitfield was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I have spent 4 years and more resources than I am going to tell you, trying to understand what my son cannot do. I have the best minds in pediatric neurology working in this building. I said, I know. He said, a janitor with a mop bucket got further in 7 months than all of it. I said, I didn't get anywhere. He did. I just put the bucket there. He looked at me for a long moment. His face was still doing the thing it had been doing. He said, I know the difference between those two things. I have been making the mistake of thinking they were the same thing for 4 years. I said, you were protecting him. He said, I was protecting myself. There is a difference. He said it the way he said most things. Factually, the way you state something that has just been verified and is no longer open for discussion. But this time the fact was about himself, and the verification had come from 12 inches of corridor floor, and I think it cost him more than most facts cost him. He asked me that morning if I would be willing to spend some time with Caleb on a more regular basis, not as a therapist, not as any kind of formal role. Just as the person who put the bucket in the right place and said yes when a 4-year-old asked to try the mop. I said yes. I have been doing that for 2 years now. Caleb is 6. He still uses his wheelchair for most of his mobility because his wheelchair is good and his arms are strong and efficiency matters. But he also walks. Not easily. Not far. Not without effort and concentration and the specific internal conversation he has with his legs before he asks them to do something. But he walks. He has decided, and this is something he told me himself with the direct precision, that is his particular quality, that walking is something he does for certain occasions, and the chair is something he does for everything else. And that both of these things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. He said, they're both mine. They're just for different things. I said, that is exactly right. He said, like your 2 mops. I said, exactly like my 2 mops. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the courtyard birds, of which he now knew the species, the seasonal patterns, and the specific individual markings of 4 regular visitors, which he had tracked in a small notebook his father had given him for the purpose. I think about my wife sometimes when I am with Caleb, not because they are similar, they are not, in any way I can name, but because she taught me the thing that made what happened in that maintenance closet possible. She taught me that the most important thing you can do for someone who is up against something hard is refuse to make their limitation the first thing you see when you look at them. She said it about Marcus, when Marcus was 9 years old and struggling with reading in a way the school was not handling well. She said, Warren, he is not his reading. He is everything else first, and the reading is just the thing that's hard right now. See the everything else. Let him show you what the reading will become once he knows you see the rest of him first. I saw the everything else in Caleb, the birds, the questions about the cleaning solutions, the precise language he used to describe things he was thinking about. The way he informed his wheels of his intentions, which was not a quirk but a strategy, a child who had understood before he could fully articulate it, that the right relationship with the things that carry you is a communicative one, not a passive one. I saw all of that first. The 12 inches came later. Everything comes later if you see the everything else first. Marcus came to the institute once to help me with a plumbing repair that needed a second pair of hands. He met Caleb in the corridor. They talked for about 10 minutes about birds and electrical wiring, which are the 2 topics Caleb is most interested in right now. When Marcus and I were done with the repair and walking to the parking lot, Marcus said, "That kid." I said. He said, "He's like you." I said, "How so?" He said, "He looks at things like they're telling him something." I said, "Things usually are." He said, "I know. You taught me that." I said, "Your mother taught us both." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I think about her when I do good work too." We drove home separately. That night I sat in my kitchen, the way I sit in my kitchen most nights, with the radio on low and the window open a little even in winter, because I like the sound of the street. I thought about 12 inches of corridor floor. I thought about a 4-year-old telling his legs where they were going. I thought about the way knowledge moves through people, from a woman who died too young to a man who learned to see people whole, to a boy who learned to take the mop handle, to a child who learned that the things that carry you work better when you talk to them. I thought about the mop in the closet, which I had been talking to for 11 years, and whether it had understood any of it. Probably not. But I feel better for having told it. So here is my question before you go, and I want you to take it seriously. Think about the people in your life whose limitations you have learned first, and whose everything else you have learned second, or not at all. Think about what you might see if you reverse the order, and think about what 12 inches might become for someone if you just put the bucket in the right place and said yes. Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one of them, and I would genuinely like to know. And if this story reached something in you today, if you believe the way I have come to believe it across 24 years of buildings and one extraordinary boy and a wife who showed me how to see, that the most important thing any person can do for another is see them whole before they see them limited, then do me one favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like so someone else finds their way here. Leave your story in the comments. I will see you in the next one. Trust me, it is worth staying for. I want to tell you one more thing about the Institute, because it belongs in this story, and I have been working up to it without knowing exactly how to say it. James Whitfield changed after the maintenance closet. Not dramatically, not overnight, not in the ways that would make a good before and after story. He changed the way buildings change when the foundation settles, slowly, without announcement, in ways you notice only because you know the building well enough to recognize what it looked like before. He started coming to the first floor more. Not for any stated reason. He would arrive in the morning, stop at the window in the waiting area where Caleb usually sat when he visited, look at the courtyard for a moment, and then go upstairs. I noticed because I know that building the way I know my own apartment, every pattern, every deviation from the pattern, every small thing that has changed from how it was yesterday. He started saying good morning, not to be polite. He had always been polite in the automatic way of someone who was raised to be polite. This was different. This was a man who had started looking at the people in the building he funded instead of through them, and the looking had changed the quality of the greeting. He asked me once, about 4 months after the maintenance closet, how Marcus was doing. I had not told him about Marcus. He had heard me mention him to Patricia in passing, months earlier, and had held on to it. I said Marcus was doing well. He said, electrician, right? Right? Yes. He said, good work. I said, he thinks so. He said, important work. I said, yes. He said, my father thought important work and visible work were the same thing. He was wrong about that. He said it the way he said most things, factually, without self-pity, as a thing that had been verified and was no longer under dispute. I said, most fathers of that generation thought that. He said, yes. I'm trying to think differently about it with Caleb. I said, I've noticed. He looked at me. He said, you notice a lot. I said, it's the job. He said, no, it's you. The job is just where you do it. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I think he was right, and I think he was wrong, and I think the truth is somewhere in between, which is where most true things lie. The job taught me the looking. 24 years of being in rooms where I was not expected to matter taught me to pay attention to everything. Because when you are not expected to matter, the only way to know what is happening is to watch carefully. The job gave me the practice, but the decision to use the practice for something, to look at Caleb and see the birdwatcher, and the question asker, and the boy who informed his wheels of his intentions. Rather than the wheelchair and the diagnosis and the prognosis, that decision came from somewhere else. It came from a woman who died at 44, and a son who needed me to see him whole when the world was reducing him to his reading scores. The job is where I do it. She is why I do it. Those are different things, and both of them are true. Caleb's notebook now has 47 bird entries. He tracks species, arrival times, behavioral patterns, what each bird was doing, and whether that behavior recurred on subsequent visits. His father bought him a proper field guide and a pair of binoculars that are slightly too large for a 6-year-old's face, but that he uses with complete seriousness. Adjusting for the size with the resourcefulness of a child who has spent his whole life adjusting for the things that are slightly too large or slightly wrong for his particular situation. He showed me the notebook last month. He opened it to an entry from October and said, "This one came every day for 2 weeks and then stopped." I said, "Do you know why?" He said, "No. But I'm going to find out." I said, "How?" He said, "I'm going to keep watching until the pattern tells me." I said, "That is exactly the right approach." He nodded, satisfied, closed the notebook, and looked back out at the courtyard. I went back to my work. The corridor needed attention. I told it what I was going to do, the way I always tell it, and I started at the far end and worked my way back toward the maintenance closet, the way I always do. Past the 12 inches of floor that look like every other 12 inches of floor, and are not. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I will be here tomorrow. The bucket will be where it always is. That is enough. It has always been enough. There is something I have not said yet about the day in the maintenance closet, and I want to say it now, because I think it is the heart of everything, and I kept circling around it without landing. When Caleb stood in that doorway with his hand on the doorframe and his legs shaking under him, the first thing I felt was not surprise. I want to be honest about that. I had not predicted it. I had not been working toward it. I had not had any conscious thought along the lines of maybe one day this child will stand up and walk toward the bucket. That thought had never occurred to me. But when it happened, I was not surprised. And I have thought about why for 2 years, and the answer I keep coming back to is this. I had stopped thinking of Caleb in terms of what he could not do approximately 4 months into knowing him. Not because I was trying to, because once you see a person's everything else clearly enough, the limitations become a smaller part of the picture, not smaller in a medical sense, not smaller in a practical sense, but smaller in the sense of, this is one thing about him and not the defining thing about him. The defining thing about Caleb is that he pays attention. The defining thing about Caleb is that he has a theory for everything, including the behavior of individual birds and the preferences of corridor floors, and the right way to communicate with the things that carry you. The defining thing about Caleb is that when he decides to do something, he tells everything relevant what is going to happen first, which is a quality I find magnificent in a 6-year-old and would find magnificent in anyone. When he stood in that doorway with his legs shaking, I was not surprised, because I knew the decision part of him. I knew that if Caleb had decided his legs were going to carry him to the bucket, his legs were going to carry him to the bucket. Because Caleb does not make decisions he does not intend to complete. His father knows this now too. I have watched James Whitfield learn it over 2 years, the way he learns most things. Thoroughly, without sentiment, with the specific intensity of a man who takes new information seriously and revises accordingly. He has revised his understanding of his son considerably, not the medical facts, which remain what they are. His understanding of who his son is inside the medical facts, which turns out to be considerably larger and more surprising than the facts suggested. He told me something last spring that I have kept. He said, "I built this institute because I lost a child I could not save and I needed to do something with that." He said, "I thought what I was doing for Caleb by funding this research was the most important thing a father could do." He said, "It turns out the most important thing a father could do was a lot simpler, and I was too busy doing the complicated version to see it." I said, "You're doing it now." He said, "Yes. Better late than not at all." He said it without self-pity, as a fact. The way he says everything now that matters. Marcus called me on a Sunday in February. He said, "Dad, I've been thinking about something you said when I was a kid." I said, "What was that?" He said, You told me that the buildings you work in know you better than most people do. Because you show up the same way every day, and you do the same work, and you don't perform for them. You said buildings tell the truth because nobody bothers to lie to them. I said, I remember saying something like that. He said, I think people are the same way. If you show up the same way every day and do the work and don't perform, they eventually tell you the truth about themselves too. I said, yes, that is exactly right. He said, Caleb figured that out at 4 years old. I said, he's a quick study. Marcus laughed. He said, he gets it from somewhere. I said, his mother was apparently a brilliant woman. He said, yeah, and his father figured it out eventually. I said, yes. Better late than not at all. He said, that sounds like something you'd say. I said, I learned it from someone who knew. I went back to work on Monday morning. The building was the same building it always is at 5:30 in the morning. Quiet, a little cold, the particular smell of a building that has been sealed overnight and is waking up. I told the corridor what I was going to do. I started at the far end. I worked my way back. The 12 inches of floor near the maintenance closet looked like every other 12 inches of floor. I mopped them the same way I mop every 12 inches. Carefully, without shortcuts. That is all I know how to do. It turns out it is enough.